This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, good. So here we go. So we started last week discussing the historical role that the Beit Knesset, that the synagogue serves, and that how we had Mount Sinai, which was God's presence tangibly felt. We had the Mishkan, which became the mobile Har Sinai, as Ramban described it. We had then, that was the Mishkan. The Mishkan was eventually established as part of the Beit HaMikdash, of the temple in Jerusalem. And we discussed also the establishment of Batei Knesiot, of the synagogues that we are familiar with, as serve as a Mikdash Ma'at, as a microcosm of the mikdash, of the temple that we no longer have. And this Beit Knesset, this microcosm, this mikdash ma'at, this mini temple, takes on much of the dinim, much of the laws and the parameters that we find by Beit HaMikdash, except one aspect which is very interesting, is that in a certain way it goes even beyond. And that's source number 19. The Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, tells us, Afilu la'acha shecharvu, even after a Beit Knesset, a synagogue, is in ruins, adayin hein bekedushatan. Nevertheless, they retain their holiness. And the same way that they must be treated with respect when they are standing, built, so too after, if they are in ruins, if they are destroyed, nevertheless, we must still treat it with respect. And it's fascinating that when one goes to the old city, the Ir Atikah, the old city of Jerusalem today, and of course you go to the Jewish quarter, there are many shuls that had been standing there that had been destroyed by the Jordanians. In 1967, the Six-Day War, the Jordanians took over the entire old city and the entire west bank of the Jordan River, and they destroyed the shuls that were there, the famous Ramban synagogue that's there. All that remained was the arch, and that has been beautifully rebuilt now. And we have rebuilt many of these synagogues that had been destroyed and desecrated during the time from 1948 until 1967, when we were able to regain these areas which had always been Jewish areas. In source number 20, Rav Rudimen, who is who of blessed memory, he was the Rosh Yeshiva of the yeshiva that I went to near Israel. So Rav Rudimen writes as follows in explanation. Let me just get that for us 1 second. Sorry, just give me 1 second. And that way when I go to the page, I won't have to do these other things. Okay, there it is for us. Good. So Rav Rudimen writes as follows in his Sichos Levi. We know that a Beit Knesset retains its holiness even after it is destroyed, whereas the holiness of Har Sinai was only temporary, right? Har Sinai does not maintain its Kedusha going forward. A Beit Knesset does. Har Sinai has no enduring holiness, and nowadays it has no holiness. The reason for this is that the holiness of a Beit Knesset is created by the prayers of the Jews there, meaning the holiness comes from people, from their prayers, and therefore this holiness can never cease. But the holiness of Har Sinai stems God's presence dwelling there for a period of time. Once his presence left the special place, the holiness ceased. And that's really very powerful when we think about it. Our tefillot, our prayers, create this lasting kedusha, this lasting holiness. And that's why I think I mentioned last time, all those tefillot, may they always say, Baruch atah Hashem, blessed you Hashem, shomea tefillah, you hear our tefillot. May you hear all those tefillot for thousands of years. Jews have been davening our special tefillah. Let him hear those tefillot and bring about that full geula. Okay, so we need to show tremendous respect to this Beit Knesset. When we walk in there, and we need to recognize that we're walking into a very special place. The Chafetz Chaim, in his Sefer Shmirat HaLashon, Chafetz Chaim literally means wants life. His name was Rabbi Yisroel Meir Kagan HaKohen, but he's known as the Chafetz Chaim because of the Sefer, the classic Sefer, the iconic Sefer that he wrote, which is about the laws of Lashon Hara. He was the first one to codify and bring it all together in a very, very clear, structured manner. The actual laws of what you're allowed to say and what you're not allowed to say, the laws of speech. And he based the name of that Sefer on the pasuk, Mi ha'isha chafetz chaim, who's the person who wants life? Guard your tongue and watch your mouth. Right? So therefore he became known as the Chafetz Chaim. And in his Shmirat HaLashon, he writes, Ubeit Medrash Shalanu Gankin B'chlal Mikdash. Our Beit Knesset, our Beit Medrash, are considered like a Mikdash. And they were commanded to be in awe of the one whose presence dwells there. If a person would, heaven forbid, not just speak idle talk, but speak Lashon Hara in such a place, it's as if a person is showing she'eino ma'amin, that this person does not believe she'HaKadosh Baruch Hu yishareh shchinato b'bayit hazeh. The person is in fact demonstrating, I don't believe that God's presence is found here. But as the pasuk says in source number 22 there, Umikdashi tira'u, you shall revere my sanctuary, my mikdash. And on that we're taught once again, and you shall fear your God. Man is commanded upon entering the Beit HaMikdash, Beit Knesset, or Beit Medrash, whether it's a shul or a study hall, and certainly the Beit HaMikdash, to act in awe and with reverence. As it says, fear my temple. It's not the temple itself which we fear, rather the one who cautions us to treat the temple with awe, mainly meaning Hashem, God. We find that a Beit Knesset, a shul, and a Beit Medrash, and a study hall, are termed a mikdash. They're called a mikdash, as it says in the last chapter of Megillah. There, the Gemara says, I shall be, quoting the pasuk in Ezekiel, Yecheskel, I shall be for them a mikdash ma'at, a small mikdash, a microcosm of the mikdash, in the lands in which I disperse them. What does that refer to? The Gemara says, the Talmud says, this refers to Batei Knesset and Batei Medrash. Therefore, they're called mikdash. So when the Torah commanded fear by mikdash, be in awe, act with a sense of awe when you're by my mikdash, then the Beit Knesset and the Beit Medrash were all included in that. And that's why we have the halach and Shulchan Aruch, that Batei Knesiot and Batei Medrashot, ein noagim behen kalut rosh, we don't act in a casual, lightheaded manner, kigon, by joking, hitul, mocking, or sicha betela, or even discussing mundane matters. We need to have this sense of reverence of in a shul, recognizing that this is the continuation of the Beit HaMikdash. Now, TVT used to have a program where they would bring, I think it was like the sixth graders, fifth, sixth, seventh, I forget, around to different shuls. And the rabbi or a representative of the shul would talk to the kids and explain to them how things go in that shul. And very often, one of the first questions they had when it came to an Orthodox shul was about the mechitza. In conservative and reform, right, they don't have such a thing. There is not separated seating by gender. And one of the questions that come up is about this mechitza. And in fact, what I would say to them is our synagogues are meant to be a microcosm of the temple. And in the temple, the men and women were separated. So let's see the historical precedent for that extends to the Orthodox shuls today. And then let's gain a better appreciation. So let's see the precedent, let's see the parameters, and let's gain perhaps a better appreciation. So source 25, once again, the Talmud, Bavli, Sukkah, right? Why on Sukkah? Because on Sukkah we had this Simchat Beit HaSho'eva, which was tremendous celebrations that took place every night of Chol HaMoed Sukkot. If it wasn't Shabbat or Yom Tov, there were these fantastic celebrations that took place. Beit HaSho'eva literally means the house of the drawing, and that refers to this concept, this mitzvah, that we would pour. There's always a wine libation on the altar along with the sacrifice. On Sukkot, they would draw water, and that would also be poured on the altar. This represented the purity of the children of Israel coming out after a Yom Kippur, and it was cause for tremendous celebration. And when there is celebration, then things can sometimes get a little bit out of hand. So it says over there, it says in the Gemara Sukkah, Mi shelo ra'a, a person who never saw Simcha Beit HaSho'eva, the happiness of the rejoicing of the Beit HaSho'eva, lo ra'a simcha meyamav. You never saw happiness. If you didn't see this happiness, this celebration, you never saw a celebration. There was no other celebration, no other rejoicing quite like this one. And the Gemara then explains how it came about. On the evening after the first day of Sukkot, again on Sukkot they did not have it. It involved torches and juggling. On the holiday, on the Yom Tov and on Shabbat, it did not happen. But on the evening after the first day of Sukkot, they went down to the women's gallery of the Beit HaMikdash, and they fixed a new construction. So the Beit HaMikdash always had what was called the Ezrat Kohanim, the Ezra, the courtyard where the Kohanim could go, and that's where they would perform the Avodah, the service. There was the Ezrat Yisroel, the courtyard of Yisroel, and there was the Ezrat Nashim. But on Simchat Beit HaSho'eva, on Sukkot, because of the large crowds, there it became even more involved. They went down to the women's gallery, the Beit HaMikdash, and fixed a new construction. Tikkun Gadol. What was this construction? Well, as it said, as it was taught, that the wall of the woman's courtyard was smooth. They later surrounded it with a balcony, and the woman should sit in the new section above and the men below. Talmud describes they built projections out of the walls, and that way, at the end of Sukkot, they would lay planks along these projections, forming a balcony for the women spectators at the Simchat Beit HaSho'eva. And in many communities, I believe in South Africa, Ian, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, that's how the shuls were normally built, that the women were in a balcony. Yeah. Okay. Why? Why separate the men and the women? So Rambam, Maimonides, discusses this in two places and actually offers two reasons. So we'll need to see lahalacha, which is the reason that we follow, because there will be halachic differences between these two reasons that are given. The first reason he gives is the Rambam in the laws of Sukkah. And he there says there, as we're discussing, this is Sukkah, the Sinka Beit HaShoeva, she'machinim makom l'nashim. They would prepare a place for the women and a separate place for the men. Makom hanashim lamala, makom hanashim gavo mimenu, and the women's section was up above. Kedei shelo yistaklu hanashim binashim. Otherwise, the men might be gazing, staring, gaping at the women. So when we are in a place of holiness, we want our focus, our attention to be drawn to the spirituality and not, oh no, how do I look? How's my hair? I don't have any hair, but how's my hair, right? There is a certain chemistry that is involved with male, female. That's what keeps the world going. But there needs to be a time and place, a time when that is focused and a time when that will not be the focus. And therefore the Rambam says, in order that the men should not be looking at the women. However, we see in source 27, Rambam, in the laws of Shofar, Sukkah, Lulav, gives a different reason. And there he says, they designated to set up a place for the women above and the men below, in order that they should not be mixing with one another. That is the issue. The issue is that we don't want the men and women to be mixing with one another. So clearly this is what was done in the Beit HaMikdash, and this carries through into our world. This is what is done in our sanctuaries, in our Batei Knesiot. But there is a halachic difference that results from these two approaches. And that is where the Igros Moshe, Rav Moshe Feinstein, who gives us the halacha on how high must a mechitza be, where he highlights this difference, because there will be a practical difference. If the idea is that the men should not see the women, so it's got to be high enough that the woman cannot be seen. That is not how it's done in most of the shuls nowadays. If the woman can't be seen, then the woman can't see. And therefore, unless they're up in a balcony, but if they're not in a balcony, if they can't be seen, then they also can't see what is happening on the men's side. And that leaves them feeling very, very disenfranchised and disassociated, disconnected from the davening. But based on the second, there is an issue that they should not be mixing with one another. So the Igros Moshe, source 28, Rav Moshe rules, it's because of this levity, this frivolity, this lightheadedness, this casualness, why we have an obligation for the mechitza. Right, which leads to socializing, which leads to touching one another, and therefore that is why we need to have the mechitza. He's going with the Rambam's second reason in source 27, and therefore in source 29, when he speaks about the height of the mechitza, he says, "Tov yoter lasod kezus rosh hanashim yulamala." It's best to have a balcony with the women up above. And if for whatever reason it's hard to make a balcony, then one needs to make a mechitza mamish, a proper mechitza, that will stop this mixing, this socializing during davening. Being that it's not to prevent one from seeing the other, but rather it's to prevent the mixing. So he says, as long as it is about shoulder height, that is sufficient. V'hu gova gimel amot shehein yudchet tvachim. That is 3 amot, which is 18 tvachim, which is about anywhere between um, about 5 feet high is what it needs to be. And that's also why here in Beth Jacob we could have a mechitza that the top part of it is glass. Because again, it's not meant that you can't see. It's meant that there should be a separation to prevent random conversations, socializing, touching, etc., as Rav Moshe wrote. The option even though the heads can be seen above it, lo yavo mizeh lidei kalut rosh. This will not lead to this frivolous behavior. Source number 30, Rabbi Soloveitchik, the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshiva University. So Rav Soloveitchik was the leader, the rabbinic leader of modern Orthodoxy. And this is going back in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, where there was a big push for conservative Judaism, and there were many who were defecting, and a big issue was the mechitza. Take down the mechitza. I remember in my previous shul, they did a great Purim skit that they wanted to raise the mechitza. And they were arguing, is it R-A-I-S-E, raise the mechitza, or raise, R-A-Z-E, the mechitza? Destroy it, take it down. So they had a great Purim skit about raising the mechitza and two people understanding it differently, and a very funny conversation that ensued between the two of them. But there was much pressure against this mechitza. And Rav Soloveitchik wrote, source number 30, the separation of the sexes in the synagogue is a basic tenet in our faith. It dates back to the very dawn of our religious halacha community, right? Meaning back to the Beit HaMikdash, and constitutes a Torah prohibition of fear that Mikdash, act in awe of that Mikdash, which can never be abandoned by any legislative act on the part of a rabbinic or lay body. So it's not like the rabbis can get together and say we no longer need this. It's not that the board, the lay leadership, can get together and vote this out, regardless of its numeric strength, no matter how strong, big, numerous they might be, or so-called prominent. What was decreed by God can never be undone by human hand. So that is Rav Soloveitchik Zatzal, who was the preeminent leader and spokesperson of, I would say, modern orthodoxy. I mean, he was a tremendous, not just modern, of orthodoxy. That's what he wrote. And Rabbi Becher adds a very interesting point to this also. And he writes in his Gateway to Judaism, a great book. I always say that this is on the must-read list for people who are converting, but it should really be on the must-read list for all Jews, because everyone could gain a lot from it. And he writes there, source number 31, an original insight into the effect of the mechitza comes from an Australian professor of social work. She writes, I have mixed feelings about the separation. While I know some people regard it an affront to the equal rights for women, I quite like the idea that my family status is anonymous. When we are not seated together, I'm not automatically regarded, someone's wife, someone's mother. I'm not regarded as someone's something, but I sit alone, stand alone. I represent myself. Rather, I have some time to myself. That's by, again, an Australian professor of social work by the name of Sally Berkovic. Right? So that way, it's not I'm there as someone's this. I'm there as a Jew coming before God. That is who I am there in the shul. And we'll just conclude. Let me scroll this down for you. Okay. This is a very important and beautiful piece that we've been discussing, that we're not supposed to be taking the mundanities of our life into the shul with us, but we're supposed to feel we're walking into a mikdash. And just as importantly, we are supposed to be taking that holiness out of the shul with us into our homes, into our workplaces, into our relationships. The command to build a tabernacle, the precursor to the Holy Temple of Jerusalem, is given in a slightly strange way. V'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham. Make for me a sanctuary, and I will dwell within you. It would seem to make more sense to say, make for me a sanctuary, and I will dwell within it. Why within you? This small distinction draws our attention to an important issue. The temple was not a glorified granny flat. God already resides everywhere. So did God need us to build him a place to reside in this world? Yes, most certainly. Meaning, he wanted a location where there would be a tremendous concentration of the divine presence. And let me just add to that when we say a concentration of the divine presence, God is here, God is there, God is truly everywhere. But it's where we make room for him, where we welcome him in. That is where there is a, so to speak, a greater concentration of the divine presence, because we are making that existing divine presence more tangibly felt and experienced. He wanted a location where there would be a tremendous concentration of the divine presence. Nowadays, with the temple destroyed, the synagogue is called a mikdash ma'at, a little temple, right? I call it a microcosm of the temple, containing relatively to the actual temple much less, but still a profound level of kedusha, of holiness. On a deeper level, though, the Torah is saying that the temple is not somewhere where we can put God out of the way. It would be all too easy in order that God can reside within it. It would be very convenient and tempting to compartmentalize God. Let me put him, God, in the temple, and there I'll worship him, speak to him, have a relationship with him, but in the rest of my life, right, I can leave God behind in his house, and when I'm not there, I can get on with my life and do as I see fit. And that is not what we would want. That would be really counterproductive. He writes, I'm always amazed that it's become the norm for Jewish men to cover their heads in a synagogue. Why is God any more inside a synagogue than he is on the street? Do we not believe in an infinite God who is everywhere? So why the distinction between the synagogue and elsewhere? I think that the reason might be that if we can confine God to the synagogue, then outside the synagogue, I'm free. I can do whatever I want. We can live our lives however we want. If we define a place that's a place where God is, By doing so, we are thereby defining other places as where God is not. And that, like I said, he writes, that's very convenient. That can be tempting, right? And that is, I'll be very devout when I'm there, and I can leave there and then do whatever I want. The Torah is saying that to make a temple, v'asuli mikdash, make for me a temple, v'shachanti b'tocham, I will dwell not in it, but in your midst. The Torah is saying that to make a temple is not to take God out of our day-to-day lives, but to help him bring him into our day-to-day lives. It's not that I have a place that I go for my spirituality and then the rest, it's just a free-for-all. No. And I'm warned not to bring the street into the shul. On the contrary, we're being told, bring the shul into your street. Bring the shul into your family. Bring the shul into your workplace. Bring the godliness into all that you do. It's not to take God out of our day-to-day lives, but to help bring him into that. The purpose of a mikdash is that God should dwell within you. And wherever you go, he is there with you. If we come to perceive him as dwelling within it, within the building, then we are missing the point. It is the role of a synagogue to inspire us to a relationship with God. It is our role to allow that inspiration to lift us even after we have returned to our day-to-day lives. So the shul's mission, its objective, what it's got to do is to inspire us to connect to God. What we then need to do is to make sure that that connection carries through even when we leave the walls, the confines of that synagogue. If a synagogue does not inspire us, there is a problem with the synagogue. But if the inspiration lasts only as long as we are in that building, then the problem is with us. So we actually have the conclusion of the continuum that we described. Just like by Har Sinai, the pasuk then says, after the Sinai experience, Shuvu lachem la'ohalechem, return to your tents. And we're taught that we need to take experience and that inspiration and bring it into our tents, bring it into our homes, bring it into our life. And then this Har Sinai became the Mishkan, so to speak. That was the mobile Har Sinai, which became the Beit HaMikdash, which eventually, with the destruction of the first and second temple, that Kedusha, that holiness, then came into our Batei Knesiot and Batei Midrashot, into our synagogues and our study halls. Then just like it began by Har Sinai, that it's meant to be a place of awe, a place of inspiration, a place of connection, and just like by Har Sinai, we were told, bring that with you back into your tents, so too, the inspiration and the connection that we forge when we are in the Beit Knesset is such that God does not want to dwell in it, he wants to dwell in you, in us. And therefore, that is something that we must take with us as we leave that Beit Knesset, as we leave that Beit Midrash, to take that with us, that should be influencing and uplifting all the things that we do in our regular day-to-day as we go on with our day-to-day. Okay, again, I learned my lesson about sending out a Thursday morning reminder, but I thank the two of you for joining, and it has been recorded for anyone else who wants to catch up. And let me wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom. Good seeing everybody. Good seeing both of you. And it's nice seeing Alex. I haven't seen Alex in a while, Rosa. It was very nice to see Alex. And Ian, please send Lana my very best regards.
Shabbat shalom. Thank you.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.